Hello and welcome to the Jo's Art History podcast, a podcast that celebrates all things art historical every single day. Welcome back to the Jo's Art History podcast, and it is episode 28. Can't quite believe it's episode 28. My goodness, we are flying through these now. Today I sit down with art historian Bryony Large for a brilliant conversation discussing the changing representation of the female figure throughout art history and what is/was considered as the ideal female form. This is a massive topic, as you can imagine, and Bryony has done an amazing job selecting 4 cornerstone works from within the Canon of Art History as a way of introducing the topic and to get you thinking about the changing perception of the female form. We discuss the male gaze in classical art history through Botticelli's Birth of Venus and what is arguably believed to be the first painting that ever sees a woman own her sexuality, Manet's Olympia. We also discuss Jenny Saville, an artist who, as Bryony so brilliantly puts it, is the destroyer of false fetishes, as well as discussing the lack of representation of disabled bodies and why Marc Quinn's Alison sculpture, which was unveiled in the early 2000s for the Fourth Plinth project in London, is a work that is so important in making you think and look again at not only what you do see, but what you do not see represented within art history and indeed society. Just to be very honest with everybody, annoyingly my internet was playing up the day that I recorded this with Bryony, and there seems to be at points throughout the episode where our voices overlap for a few seconds. It doesn't take away from the brilliant conversation, but I just want to apologise, as it does on occasion sound like Bryony and I are talking over each other. Again, like I said though, it's only a few seconds here and there throughout the podcast. And it's classic technology. It's amazing until it fails you. It's a really excellent episode that'll get you thinking about the female form and how it has and is represented within art history and what we can do to change that, and why it's important that artists do challenge it, and why it's important that people challenge this and always fight for equal and accurate representation of all bodies. So sit back and relax as Bryony and I discuss the ideal female form within art history. I think really the first question is what got you interested in this topic of the ideal female body?
I guess I've always been so interested in kind of feminism and just kind of female rights and the feminist movement, but it wasn't really until I started my degree that I kind of thought, no, this is something that I'd quite like to have a niche in, quite like to have a specialism in. And I just found it really interesting the ways that throughout the ages, kind of how art has been used to portray the different ideals of women throughout time, because it is continuous. Like, it hasn't been one set kind of image of femininity. It's changed throughout every century, every decade, to be honest, especially in the 20th century. And I guess what's something that's really interesting for me is that it kind of all changed a lot kind of towards modernism and the avant-garde, and then coming towards contemporary art. And this is kind of the time that I'm alive, and we're really seeing a lot of progress, especially with artists such as Jenny Saville. So I think if I was gonna pick a time to really get involved in this topic, now's a great time. And yeah, it's probably my degree really is something that really kind of kicked it off, and learning a lot about, because I do art history, you know, one of my first topics in first year was the human body and how the image is represented in Greek art and antiquity, and I think that's really where it kicked off for my interest anyway. Yeah,
for me it's such a intriguing topic, and I think that you've picked 4 brilliant examples that very much sort of span art history, very sort of cornerstone pieces within their time, within, you know, at that moment within art history. And when you sent me the 4 that we're going to talk about, I was like, this is like bang on, particularly the last one. I'm very excited to talk about the last one. So let's look at the first work that you sent me. And this is completely iconic. This is something you'll know the image visually, but you might not potentially know the
Yeah.
artists. So do you want to tell us about the first image that you chose?
Yeah, of course. So Birth of Venus, Botticelli, as you said, it's an absolutely classic piece. It is a cornerstone of the Renaissance. You're right, it's one of those paintings that you see everywhere. And I was going to add, how many memes have been made out of this, painting. It just shows just how famous it really is. But yeah, I guess it is a mythological painting from the Renaissance, and it was a little bit controversial for its time because it was the first non-religious nude since classic antiquity, and that was a little bit different to kind of the female nudes that had been painted before. But then it also had a lot of traditional kind of conventions. Birth of Venus, she is the goddess of love, and that's quite rooted in Greek art of how women in paintings were only ever really presented as either a seductress or a goddess. So Botticelli kind of gives that traditional convention in this painting, but also I found it's quite controversial in the way that this goddess, she's nude, and I know that in Greek art, goddesses were kind of meant to be fully clothed, whereas a seductress was kind of half nude, semi nude, or fully nude. So again, Botticelli he goes against some of the traditional notions of painting the female nude in its time. I also find this painting really interesting because of I think it's a beautiful painting. I think it's gorgeously painted, but also it has very heavy themes of idealization and beauty, which links quite a lot with antiquity. And it's not really surprising, I guess, because the Renaissance was described as, the rebirth of antiquity. But I think for me, why I chose this piece is because I do feel like it allows for the male gaze, which isn't surprising, just because of the time that it was painted. But Venus, she's looking away. She's not directly looking at the viewer. Her hands are kind of leading into place for the viewer to see, and that allows, I guess, for the male viewer to have that gaze back then in that time. But yeah, it's a really, really beautiful painting, I think.
So just to pick up on a couple of things you said there, for someone at home that perhaps for the first time is hearing the male gaze, what is this? That's a huge big question. I completely understand that, but could you give a very sort of brief overview of what is
Yeah, of
the male
course.
gaze?
I guess I see the male gaze as the observation of the female as an object of male pleasure. I think, to be honest, the best way to describe it is probably through John Berger, who quoted, "Her body is arranged the way it is to display it to the man looking at the picture. The picture is made to appeal to his sexuality. It has nothing to do with her sexuality. Women are there to feed an appetite, not to have any of their own." So that was really popular, and it still is popular in art, where the whole purpose of the woman in the painting was to be an object of male pleasure, to be there for the man to look at and enjoy. So yeah, I think that's how I'd briefly describe it.
I think that is nail on the head, fantastic description there. Like, I think if you asked me, I couldn't have put it any better. I don't even think I would have got it anywhere near as good. And I love that John Berger's an iconic,
It's
I
an
don't
iconic
know,
quote, and an iconic
yeah,
person as well, I suppose. But yeah, it is a hard thing to describe. I think the male gaze, I've definitely had to wrap my head around it a couple of times.
yes, and it is this huge black hole of sort of theories
Yeah.
and writings, and really, really interesting. To go back a little bit,
Yeah.
to look at Venus, you said that Botticelli's idealized her. In what way has he sort of idealized Venus?
I feel like he's idealized her a lot by just her form, her hair's like in the wind, long bright hair. She's nude, so that's idealizing her back for that time. Like, she's a goddess, and it just shows through the image, with every other figure in that image are just leading the viewer's eyes to her. And yes, she's kind of off center, so it's she's probably the first person you look at anyway, but everything in that image just leads to her. Like, she is the centerpiece, and she is kind of the epitome of beauty, and especially kind of the way she's standing on that big gorgeous shell kind of coming into shore. And I guess in terms of typical conventional beauty standards at the time, you know, she's tall, she's, you know, got a kind of figure that was very accepted for the Renaissance, and yeah, she's a goddess. She's so, if she is idealized just because of who she is, especially the goddess of love.
Yeah, and for me, what I love is her stare, and there has been so much written
Yeah,
on who she was, who the model might have been, and just really, because you could just look at this painting, but
yeah,
particularly her face, for hours and never get bored of it. What I really love is that you've pointed out, and actually I've never really noticed it before. You're right, everything brings you back to Venus, even how the trees bend, the winds from the gods, even the nymph, the spring nymph that sort of
yeah,
runs from the shore to like dramatically clothe
100%.
her. What I love about this is that she's kind of embarrassed, and it's kind of one of the, is she embarrassed? I don't know. This is where I sit in the fence. She has this idea of, she knows that she's naked, so she's very much sort of
Yeah,
covering her modesty. Same way she's not, I don't know, is she embarrassed about it? I mean, I feel, I mean, that's a huge
yeah,
question again in itself. Yeah, she is
mm-hmm.
perfectly beautiful and isn't ashamed by it, but knows kind of like, oh, someone's sort of coming to cover her, so
Yeah, I
it will
guess
be
that
okay.
you're right there, because I never really thought of it that way. It does seem like, you know, the other figure is kind of rushing to clothe her, so that makes you feel like, oh, like, is she like embarrassed? But then again, that wouldn't surprise me if that was kind of how Botticelli wanted to represent her, because women, especially like presented nude in art, they weren't meant to kind of seem confident like a man was if they were kind of painted nude. It was, they were kind of supposed to look a bit like, oh, like this, you know, I don't want to be seen this way, covering myself, you know. So yeah, I think that's a really valid point. I never really thought of it that way. If it could be, her facial expression could represent some sort of embarrassment, um, for her nudity. So yeah, that's interesting.
I don't know if you've listened to previous episode on the podcast where I speak to a jeweler about the history of pearls within art history. And it's for anyone that's listening that hasn't, it's number 8. And we start to talk about Charles the First pearl earring, and then we sort of move through very much sort of idealized depictions of pearls and shells and things. And the jeweler that I interview, Yachu, she talks about how it's important as well to remember that at this time, pearls
Yeah,
were sort of highly prized objects, and they were the beauty of the sea, the beauty of the world, and that by Botticelli sort of putting, you know, the female figure, not
yeah,
just Venus, the female figure within one of these shells is, and she's this, like you said earlier, this beautifully
yeah.
pale skinned, untouched by human hands. She is the pearl of the
Yeah,
world, the female figure.
100%. She presents the just the quality, I guess, of what a woman was supposed to look like back then, you know, and Botticelli really kind of presents that. I also just thought, like you've just said about her being kind of like freshly out, like she's not been touched by, you know, any human hand. Do you think that adds to the idealization of her and her beauty, because she's pure and she's not been touched and she's completely fresh and new? And do you think that adds to her beauty, especially back then?
Yeah, but I also think it maybe adds to her gaze as well. If you think about that concept that because the whole idea is this, the story sort of mythologically is, you know, Venus was born
Yeah,
as a fully formed woman, and it's the north wind that you see to the left hand side of her
yeah,
that's blowing her to shore. Yeah, if I think about the idea that she's pure and she's
yeah,
this new untouchable thing, it was also, you know, what women you were supposed to, you know, society wise, you had to
yeah,
be in order to be desirable. You weren't supposed to, you know, it was scandalous if, you know,
yeah,
if you're seen out with men, if you weren't sort of respectable in any sort of way. And yet here he represents this beautiful woman, although naked, is very respectable
yeah.
and is very aware of perhaps her as a siren almost
Mm-hmm,
of
a
the
hundred percent.
ocean,
Yeah,
of the world.
no, definitely. That's really interesting.
Just picking
Yeah,
up on something that you said about the whole idea of she's not looking at the viewer, and that she's this very sort of almost demure,
yeah,
not directly looking at you. and it gives it this mystery. So I think it leads really nicely into the next image, which is completely polar opposite. And I love that you've picked this to like put them
100%.
both together. What is the second work that you think shows a real sort of advancement forward in the male gaze and how the
Yeah,
female
sure.
is
So
depicted?
the next kind of artwork that I picked is Olympia by Edward Manet, and that was painted in 1863. So it is a bit of a jump in time, but I honestly think this is one of my favorite paintings. It was so unconventional. It was so avant-garde and controversial for its time in so many different ways. You know, it's not only just kind of the content, the way it was painted was very controversial for its time, and it does contrast so much with Birth of Venus, purely just in, I think, in the fact of that the nude woman is staring, glaring almost directly at the viewer, which is not something that we see in Birth of Venus, as we've discussed. You know, she's looking away and looking, you know, possibly looking quite embarrassed or feeling kind of modest, whereas the female nude in Olympia, her hand is assertively covering herself. She is looking directly at the viewer, and it's been described by so many people as the pinnacle of defiance towards patriarchy, just because of that absolute rejection of the male gaze. So I really do love this painting just because of how unconventional it was for the time. So yeah, it's very interesting.
I remember the first time I saw this was in a lecture when I was in first year. And it is one of these things,
Yeah,
it's so different. I mean, the subject and how the female is sitting,
yeah,
the composition is nothing new, but it's just amazing how when you change how a figure
yeah,
looks out of a canvas, it's so powerful. And when it was displayed,
yeah,
people were up
yeah,
in arms about it. They thought it was
100%. I think
disgusting.
something that was quite a common complaint is that people thought it failed to properly elevate the woman's nakedness to the lofty ideals of nudity at the time. And I just love how Manet, um, you know, you can see a very short outline, like a dark black outline around that figure, which is almost kind of another, like, you know, middle fingers up to all these critics of kind of, you know, really outlining, no, this is how I want to paint my kind of model, and there's nothing that you can do about it really. But yeah, it's such a symbolic painting as well, especially like her left hand. It's just so much dominance in the painting, and it kind of really shows how it differs from Birth of Venus. I think Manet wanted to paint his figure as a woman and not a goddess, which I really like.
Mm, yeah, Bryony, I love that. And also the fact that what I think people found so shocking, and again, very much thinking about how women were at the time and what they were, their sort of air quotes here, their
Yeah,
expected roles in society. You know, they were demure, they weren't these sexual beings. And yet, here, Manny has depicted this woman, as you said, very much
yeah,
sexually aware, in control of herself, and like
mm,
unashamed addressing it. And this is what's kind of sent shockwaves really, because people were appalled that
yeah.
it was as brazen.
There was definitely a lot of shock factor, and I just find it really interesting how obviously for us, we don't find this shocking. You know, we love it. It's empowering,
Yeah.
and it's interesting to think of how kind of a 19th century audience viewed this. They just couldn't grasp it. It was just too modern. It was too modern for that time, and especially because, you know, it rejected that male gaze that we were talking about earlier with Birth of Venus. That was just shocking in itself and very controversial for the painting at the time. Yeah, I mean, there's so many factors of why it was so unconventional. I think one thing that I found is a lot of art critics dismissed it because apparently she was too thin and she looked too adolescent for a woman. So even then, body image is coming into
Yeah.
this painting of why it was criticised so heavily, which is just fascinating of how much that kind of controls females in art still.
Well, that's it. And he doesn't really. I mean, if you look at it, he doesn't really give a horrendous amount of detail to, for example, her abdomen or her breasts, for example. He really, like you said previously, he really pays
Yeah,
attention to her figure, the curves of her body, and
yeah,
that's where he places sort of the emphasis. For me, it's in sort of looking at this again, because of course this is like again iconic cornerstone piece within, you know, art history. But what I found really interesting about looking at it again and sort of looking at it from the
yeah,
idea of the male gaze, I love the idea of that we've kind of just stumbled into, because essentially people
yeah,
thought she was a high class prostitute and or sex worker, and the whole idea is, you know, there's a cat at the end of, you know, this sort of chaise longue, this bed, and we're apparently supposed to be the,
yeah,
you know, we've come into her boudoir to
yeah,
essentially do
yeah,
business, have, you know, complete that transaction. And this was particularly because it was high society, you know, this was when it was displayed at the salon, it was only people of
yeah,
upper class that could come and view these things because you had to, it was a paying exhibition. I love the idea that it's confronting the sort of elephant in the room that a lot of these high class
yeah,
men had high class prostitutes or visited prostitutes
yeah,
regularly, and yet it was never addressed, and it was just don't talk about it, everyone knows but we don't talk about it. And yet he's very blatantly being like, let's address it, let's maybe that's why it caused so much outrage, I feel, because you have to remember at the time as
yeah,
well, all the critics were men, women weren't allowed to write, so why was it so offensive to men? And of course, like you said, if we think about what we have at our fingertips today in terms of, you know, the internet and the kind of things that we see even on TikTok, like before we started sort of recording, we were talking
yeah,
about TikTok and Zoom and all these sorts of things. And I saw a really great TikTok actually, and it was like, oh, 90s kids when they learned a dance move, and it was very
yeah.
much, you know, step to the side and click your fingers. And then it
True.
was kids today, and they're, you know,
True.
dancing to what?
Very true.
So coming at it from like a modern day perspective, as in like us in, you know, 2021, it's not very shocking, but this really did send shockwaves, and I wonder if
Yeah.
Manny really touched a nerve
Definitely, and
with people.
100%. That the point you made about, you know, kind of these high class men who viewed this painting for the first time, it wasn't it wasn't unordinary. It wasn't unordinary for them to, you know, be engaged with the kind of activity that Manet was depicting, but they hated it because, as you said, it's something that was taboo. It was hidden. It wasn't spoken about. I think the greatest thing about it is it's so honest. This painting, it's so honest in so many ways, and I think that's why a lot of people didn't like it, because it was confronting some truths. And I guess maybe, you know, some of these art critics, some of these men at the time, just didn't want this taboo subject to be public discourse, public conversation. And I think that one of art's principal motives, is to present public discourse. So yeah, it's unsurprising that it was controversial for the audience at the time, but it's definitely fascinating to think about it in comparison to this time. So yeah.
Just sort of drawing on something that you said a little earlier about, you know, the whole idea that she has this kind of
Yeah.
almost unwomanly, kind of childish figure, and that the idea of how the figure is portrayed in art, and it's
No.
not idealized in any sort of way, he's just kind of representing, you know, women come in all shapes and
Yeah.
sizes, it's another kind of another form of woman. And I think again leads on very nicely to your third painting, which I'll be very honest, I only came across this painting for the first time in December 2020. And when I saw it, I
Where
was
have you
like,
been
what?
hiding?
What have you been doing? Oh, it's amazing.
Yeah.
And so the artist is Jenny Saville, and she is dictionary
Oh,
definition of middle
100%.
finger up to the
Yeah.
male gaze, the idealized body. But yeah, do you want to tell us a
Yeah,
little bit about this
it's
painting? Because
amazing.
I love it.
It's a so yeah, by the contemporary painter Jenny Saville, and she has proclaimed herself as an anti-beauty artist, which I think leads on perfectly to her piece, which is called Propped, and it was painted in 1992. So again, kind of like another jump from the previous painting. It is a self-portrait, and it's been described as a hyperbolic self-portrait, so it's very exaggerated, and it kind of depicts a woman propped up on a chair, looking very uncomfortable, almost like she's in pain, gripping at her thighs. And I think something that was picked most up on for this painting was that the figure is exaggerated. She is a larger form of woman, and Saville has kind of said herself that these paintings, because she's painted a series of paintings like this, were inspired by her trip to America and coming across bigger women, and she wanted to paint ordinary women and just be honest about the female form today. It was even for the 90s, it was controversial and it was a shock factor, and especially because it was a part of the exhibition Sensation by Charles Saatchi, which was, a lot of countries refused to exhibit because of how controversial all the works were in that exhibition. I guess the main point of Propped, Saville's hyperbolic self-portrait, is that it shattered any remaining unrealistic portrayals of female beauty in the late 20th century. I mean, the 90s, it was the era of the waif, it was thin, starkly too thin, was how women, were supposed to look like. And it's I didn't say, but it is a nude woman, so it was really a destroyer of false fetishes in terms of the tradition of the nude. And yeah, it's an amazing painting, like just in the way that it's painted and also just the content in itself. So yeah, it's really, really fascinating.
Oh, I love that, the sort of destroyer of false fetishes, because you're so right. The 90s, when you think of like iconic 90s people, it's pencil thin Kate Moss, or all these painstaking, but it's even like pop stars and movie stars where they're you can see their ribs, and it's you think of it now and it's painful to look at these images. And yet, even now, though, something like this. So, for example, when I posted this on my Instagram, December 2020, and one of my female friends messaged me and said, "That's really ugly. I thought I'd accidentally followed someone."
Yeah.
And I was like, "Oh." So even today, when people see it,
that's quite sad in a way, isn't it? That there is still that kind of idea when we look at paintings of people, of just a body that isn't, the supreme ideal of our time. She's not the Kim Kardashian, she's not a Kendall Jenner in this painting. If we automatically think, ugh, that's not right, like that's not acceptable, that's ugly, which I think is just, I think in a way Saville knows this, so she wanted to paint a very exaggerated female form, but also be really honest. And I think for me, this painting is nowhere near the terms of, for me, ugly, but I do feel some sort of discomfort when I look at this painting, just because of the figure, of how she's, she looks uncomfortable, she's gripping at her thighs, she's not looking, she can't really, she's kind of looking through under her lids at the viewer, and she just looks so uncomfortable. And I think for me that really depicts the way that a lot of women probably felt in that era of the 90s, who felt they couldn't adapt themselves understandably to this kind of heroine chick figure. And it probably did provide a lot of uncomfort, that it's hard, it's to try the shackles of trying to be like the ideal form of beauty in our age. It can feel uncomfortable at times when you feel like you have to look a certain way because society tells you to. So I think, Saville depicts so many things in this painting. I think it's really, really, really fascinating.
Like you said, at the time in the 90s, she was it really was like a middle finger up to, I guess, essentially her reclaiming her own body and saying to people, like, there is a struggle there. I understand this. And you're so on the nose there when you say you're so uncomfortable, and yet it just draws you in, and you kind of wonder, is she in pain? Is she in ecstasy? Is she like what is
Yeah.
happening here? And it's all it is a figure sitting on a stool, but it's so much more than that. And I would seriously encourage anyone that's listening that hasn't looked at this painting before or seen it before, go and have a Google or check it out on my Instagram and my website. But it's so powerful. And it also has a
Yeah.
quote written over it as well, but it's backwards, I believe. So
Yeah.
it's a quote from a feminist writer, and it says, if we continue to speak in this sameness, speak as men have spoken for centuries, we will fail each other. Again, worlds will pass through our bodies above our heads, make us disappear.
Really powerful.
Oh, so powerful. And this was actually what's really important, I think,
Yeah.
to remind people is that, this was painted in 1992. This was actually Saville's um, sort of graduation piece when she left Edinburgh University.
Gosh,
So this
so
is her
talented.
fresh out of uni, showing the world what she can do. And
Yeah.
and Charles Saatchi comes along and completely snaps her up.
She's not hiding. She doesn't hide behind what she's painted, and
Yeah.
she's proud of it, and like God, she should be. I think this is one of her most. I think it is the most famous painting she's produced so far, or at least definitely top 5. And it's crazy to think that this was her first that kind of piece coming out of graduation, like her graduation piece. Just shows how talented she was back then and how talented she is now as well.
Yeah, but also
Mm,
I think angry as well. Like there's this sort of anger and this sort of fed upness, and also this way where she's like, no, I am going to take up space,
yeah.
because actually she sits against a white backdrop near
Hmm.
enough, and
Yeah.
it is just her, this figure
Yeah.
taking up space,
It's
and
definitely.
it's
Don't
kind
you
of like
find
a
it's
rally cry
interesting how
almost.
she's kind of propped up, like almost for the viewer to see? Very similar to how I feel the other 2 paintings that we've discussed so far, they're propped up in some sort of way for the viewer to see, but they're all for different reasons. And with this piece, it's in the name, propped. The figure is propped up on this stool in the center of the painting. It really confronts you, like no matter which way you look at it, and it's so powerful and impactful as well.
Well, it's that whole idea of, I think when you think of something like sculpture, for example, it's the whole idea, if it's
Yeah.
elevated on a plinth, it's this, higher art form. And she's kind of making her body,
Yeah.
or the female body, the highest art form
Hmm.
here, by sort of placing it on this plinth, this stool. And she's not necessarily saying it's a lovely thing to see, it's painful for her, it's
Yeah.
uncomfortable, but not only for her as the sitter and the subject, but also for the viewer. But it's makes you question, and I love it. I just, like I said, came across it a few months ago,
No,
and I'm still,
it's
oh
amazing, and
gosh, I will never get bored
I
of
don't know
looking at
about
this.
you, but it makes me think kind of the way that we look at Olympia and how we kind of we embrace it and we think it's quite powerful, whereas the audience back then, majority of people didn't like it. And I found that with a lot of criticisms of props, a lot of people who might not necessarily know the motives behind the work, they don't like it, they find it uncomfortable, they find it ugly. And it makes me wonder, are we as an audience kind of going through what that 19th century audience went through with Olympia? And that makes me feel, okay, well, in a century's time, what kind of art are we going to be producing where the audience then will kind of look back at Saville's pieces and think this isn't controversial, this is part of everyday life now. And I
Mm.
feel like without works like Olympia, it makes way, it makes room gradually for paintings like Saville was like propped. And I think that makes me feel really optimistic about the future of contemporary art and the future of contemporary art depicting the female form. I always think that's really interesting to think about.
And I think what's really exciting as well is when you think of, how much access women have now to, and the whole
Yeah.
idea of embracing, your natural figure, your curviness, and being
Hmm.
being more open about that, and having more women, more importantly,
Yeah.
on platforms like social media, using it for good and sort of beating the drum for you don't have,
Yeah.
all bodies come in different shapes and sizes. Everybody should be celebrated. And it's kind of like, do you remember a few years ago when there was that controversy around, it was a Tuba ad in, I think, about 2015, and it was for the
Okay.
Are You Beach Body Ready? It was that sort of low-cal drink, and it was this pencil thin woman in a yellow bikini, I'm sure it was, and she was gorgeous, not taking anything away from it, but essentially
Oh
it
dear.
was selling a product that helped women lose weight quickly. There was this barrage of like
Yeah.
women online that were like, my body is also beach body ready.
Yeah, of
And it's why
course.
you sometimes get that meme where people are like, the beach is getting whatever body I give it. You don't need to be sort of skinny. And I'm still pulled up for it as well. I said something to my friend the other day. She makes very beautiful but very sort of skimpy outfits for festivals. And I said to her, oh my
Yeah.
goodness, they're gorgeous, but I'm going to need to lose about 8 stone before I look any good in it. And she was like, no,
Yeah.
Carvey Girls festivals and look amazing in this stuff too. And I was like, yep, you're right. Really
Oh yeah.
sorry.
I
But
don't think we
it's
even
also like
as women
training
realise
yourself
that
to catch
internal
yourself
misogyny
when
we
you think
have
like that.
sometimes, because we are just we're trained to think that way.
Mm.
We really are. So that's why I just love artworks like this, because they don't just confront the male viewer, they confront the female viewer as well to think differently. And it is, you're right, it is about training yourself to think otherwise, because it is so unfortunately so natural for us to think that way. Like, oh, summer's coming up, I need to lose weight, I need to look toned, I need to do this, I need to do that. And it's like, oh, why do we have to think like that? We're absolutely perfect the way we are. I'm just gonna go into some of the way that I look, and I'm not gonna
Mm.
force myself to be any different just to fit somebody else's, you know, construct of what beauty is. Because at the end of the day, it's made up. It's not real. It's not a fact.
Yeah, it's not this one size fits all. It's actually also confronting the idea of, like, just bang on what you said, confronting the male
Yeah,
viewer, confronting the female viewer, but also confronting the public in general to show a better representation of all the
100%.
different sort of shapes and sizes and conditions and that people come in. And I think this really nicely leads on to the last work that you've
Yeah,
chosen. And I was like, yes, when you sent me this, because I think even comparing
yeah,
Saville's prompt to now
yeah,
a male artist representation of a female body is so interesting. But can you tell us what this work is and why it's important sort of
yeah.
art
Of course.
history
So,
sort of within the canon
this
of art history,
last
because it's very
piece is a
contemporary.
sculpture, and it's by Marc Quinn, who was a part of the Young British Artists, and it is called Alison Lapper Pregnant. And it is a sculpture depicting Alison Lapper, who's an artist who was born with, I'm hoping I pronounce this right, phocomelia. So she has no arms and she has shortened legs. And I think what is really significant about this sculpture is that it was put on the Fourth Plinth, and the Fourth Plinth, that's located in Trafalgar Square in London, where after standing empty for nearly 2 centuries, the decision was made by the council to allow for commissions for kind of pieces of artwork to be a kind of a rolling program of temporary artworks on this plinth. And this was the first Mayor of London commission. And yeah, it's made out of marble. It's a marble figure, and it was a huge boost for disabled rights in the UK. And Quinn said himself that he didn't have any intention of doing this, but it was such a boost for disabled rights in the UK. It did a lot of social good, and an inflatable version of this sculpture was actually a centerpiece of the London 2012 Paralympic Games and the opening ceremony. And it really brought, again, something that I find is just quite hidden in society. Again, disability seems to continue to be a marginalized subject, but this sculpture, it brought it to the front of the news agenda at the time. And yeah, it was, Quinn said himself, he wanted to present a new model of feminine heroism, and yeah, he did perfectly that. it's an amazing sculpture.
Oh my goodness. Again,
Yeah,
I just love
yeah,
this. First of all, I love the Fourth Plinth as a program. I think it's really, really important. I mean, I work in a sculpture
yeah,
gallery. My passion is sculpture. I could beat the drum all day about sculpture. But
mhm,
this work is so pivotal. It's oh my goodness. And what's amazing is he just
yeah,
uses one material, so it's this beautiful, rich, pure white marble. Again, very much linked through all the figures that we've spoken about. It's this he's
yeah,
kind of playing with the idea of, historically these idealized, very pale figures. This is what a woman should
yeah,
be, and he's offering the public on a huge grand scale an alternative view for what women and bodies look like, and more
mhm,
importantly, you sort of banging the drum
yeah,
to say, and that's great, this is great too, and this is powerful too. What I think is really interesting in sort of reading for this podcast is that I found this Guardian article, and they were sort of talking about, essentially, before it was
right,
even unveiled, people knew what it was going to be, because essentially there's a selection process where it's
it
narrowed
could
down to
be,
6 people, and the public can go in
yeah,
and view what final six, yeah, exactly what it could be. And when this was
ugh,
chosen, people were
yeah,
outraged. And this is like 2003, 2004, when this was selected. People were disgusted. And I found this quote with someone
oh
saying
dear.
that it cannot aspire to the condition of art. What is that?
Honestly,
Like, what
I
even
honestly, there's
is the
sometimes
condition
I
of art?
really
Like, and
hate
also,
that
who the hell are you?
about the art world, is that there's a lot of there's a lot of thought and theory that there needs to be certain kind of categories and, a check by check list of what art has to be, what it can't be. And it's like, no, like, who is anyone to say, oh, that's art, that isn't, that's appropriate art, that's bad art? But God, yeah, that's just quite shocking to hear that comment.
And yeah, and I completely agree with you with the whole idea of who the heck
Yeah,
decided that this is art and this isn't. And I think this is one of the big problems with art history and people engaging with art in general. People think
yeah,
in order to be welcome in these spaces, you need to know what's right
yes,
and what's wrong. But what's brilliant about it is, you and I love this piece, but someone listening to this
very
could be
true.
like, I think this piece is disgusting and it makes me uncomfortable. And that's also a valid response. It is. And
Yeah,
nothing,
true.
we're not right.
So
They're not, just as, they're not wrong. It's, like, I don't understand what it is around the subject of art. And this is what I'm trying to do with this
yeah,
podcast, is just, invite loads of people from different backgrounds to talk about things that interest them and get the conversation going. Because I
mhm,
think, people
no,
could feel quite comfortable talking about,
no,
a sport, for example, but we're not
yeah,
sportsmen. I'm not a footballer, but I could quite happily have a
no,
conversation about football. I'm also, but you're not an artist. People aren't artists that are perhaps listening to this, but you are still
yeah,
very valid in your opinions and having these conversations, and more importantly,
yeah,
visiting these things. And what's great about the Fourth Plinth, like you said, it's an outside public commission. It was free. And actually, I found a really great quote from Quinn where he was essentially, hold on, look, this is
yeah,
where I've lost it. Oh, he said, so it says, Quinn believes London is the only city in the world that could have commissioned such a sculpture. And quoting Quinn,
mhm,
it says, it's a city that's not afraid of taking risks. It's a place that's full of tradition, but
yeah.
also about innovation,
That's
capable of
lovely.
embracing the future.
That's
And it's
really
a
lovely.
city of
And I guess
diversity.
like your
This
your
work
your your
embraces
point
that too.
about kind of saying, some
Mm,
people might like it, that's valid, and some people might not. And I guess that's why this sculpture is so powerful, because it wasn't the public. Normally if you wanted to go see art, and you people would go into an art gallery or go into a museum, whereas just passers by were seeing this sculpture. So that didn't obviously invite a lot more opinion than it would from an artwork in a gallery. Those who would never ordinarily choose to attend a contemporary art exhibition were now confronted head on. And yeah, no, I definitely agree with Quinn there. I think It encourages the passersby to ponder, the subjects he's depicting in disability, and London I think is a great city to do that in. So yeah, I definitely agree.
I mean, this work is just incredible, and it's
Yeah.
so important in so many things. But I've got a quote here from Alison, who of course is the sitter, and she says,
Mm,
"I regard it as a modern tribute to femininity, disability, and motherhood. It is so
yeah,
rare to see disability in
that's
everyday
brilliant.
life, let alone naked, pregnant, and proud." Yeah, and that is exactly what she is when she's on this plinth. And actually, I'm not too sure where the
Yeah.
sculpture is now, because essentially when they're up on a plinth for maybe like a year and a half, and then they sort of go off. But again, much like what Saville was trying to do with props, it makes you think why, if you find this sort of shocking or
Yeah.
perhaps uncomfortable to look at, it's because it's not in
Hmm.
your everyday radar. And yet, for so many people, it's their everyday, and it should be our everyday as well. It speaks to the need to diversify, the need to
Yeah.
sort of champion that disabilities, disabled bodies are valid bodies, and they're worthy of being
Yeah.
art subjects just as
Yeah.
much as
Completely. And
Botticelli's Venus
I
and Manet's
suppose
Olympia.
like you said, when we look at these sculptures or paintings and we start to feel uncomfortable or think, oh, I don't know about this, they make you question, wait, why do I feel like this? Why do I feel uncomfortable? Why isn't this in my everyday radar? Because it is very much a part of so many people's everyday, and I think, yeah, it's such a powerful sculpture, and it makes you question, you know do we treat disabled people equitably and compassionately, or do we too often just close our eyes to disability? And this sculpture says, nope, sorry, you can't close your eyes to this. It's here for you to see, so here we are. um so yeah, very influential piece. Oh,
Yeah, absolutely. And in this very
and it's whiteness as
traditional
well, like,
material
the
within the
color
canon of art
white,
history,
that's
marble,
so
this, yeah.
important for sculpture throughout the history of art. um and yeah, it's very traditional, which I think makes it even more impactful.
Yeah, and there's a permanence with the material as well. There's this
Yeah.
clout almost, that's when something is
Yeah.
is made in marble. It has
Yeah,
a stance.
definitely.
It's elevated. It's forever. It's important. It's an amazing work, Bryony. I have loved chatting to you about these four very different but very important works of art from the canon of art history. So thank you so much for, first of all, agreeing to come on, but also giving me this great chat. It's been
Yeah,
so
no,
brilliant
thank
to
you so
hear
much
your
for
views and,
like letting me
yeah,
come
just
on.
discuss
I've
some
really
brilliant
enjoyed the
art.
chat. And yeah, thank you so much for letting me talk about it.
Absolutely
Definitely
fine if not.
encouraging anybody who's listening to this to engage with these pieces, because you know they're amazing, and engage with pieces that confront you. Don't be afraid of looking at a piece, and don't be afraid of how you feel, just as long as you think afterwards, oh, I wonder why I feel like that. Because I think that's really, really important in contemporary art.
I think that is a brilliant point. Like, sit with your feelings with something. And even if you don't like something, a work of art, my colleague Mel's brilliant at
Yeah.
this. She always says to
Yeah.
people when they come to the gallery
100%. It's
and
the
they don't
why.
like it,
I
she
think
goes, well,
that's the
that's still a
ultimate
valid
question.
response, but why don't you like it?
So yeah, very important.
Amazing. Okay, Bryony, I have one final question for you, and it is the Joe's Art History podcast. So you can take this question as
Okay.
sort of large or as personal to you, and it's quite a big question,
I
and that is,
God, what a question.
why is art
I
important?
think art is important because it communicates such big topics with very little words, and it acts as such a great learning tool of not only the present but also the past, of culture, of society, of politics. It's such a great learning tool, art is, and it runs parallel with everyday life, with what goes on in our world, and it's great for future generations to kind of use as like a history class, really. But yeah, it's so important. It communicates topics that sometimes words just can't do right. So yeah, that's probably my answer for that one.
I love that. And I love that you said that it runs parallel with everyday life, because it does. And it's so important. It can be used in so many different
Yeah.
ways. And yeah, as an indicator for how you feel, how you respond to things, as a tracker for moments in time. And even something like,
Yeah.
The Alison Lapper's sculpture, if that was unveiled today, for example, in
Yeah.
2021, would it have kicked up the same amount of controversy and essentially upset what it did? But that's why it's so important within its time. 2005 really wasn't a long time
No.
ago. It might be for, young people listening to this, but it's really, really not. And within the history of the world and all the things that have happened, this
Oh, 100.
shouldn't have. Before you go,
Yeah.
where can people find you and
You can
connect with
find
you
me.
and
I have an
see what you're
arts
up to?
blog that is can be accessed at www.confessionsofanartjunkie.com, and then I also have social media for that blog on Instagram. It's the same name, Confessions of an Art Junkie, and Twitter, Confessions, and then OA, capital AJ. And yeah, that's where you can find me if you want writing on art and lots of cool funky quotes from renowned artists. So yeah.
Amazing. And I'll link all that as well in the show notes below, as always. Thank you so much for coming on. It's
Yeah,
been an absolute
100%. Thank
pleasure
you so much
to
for having me
talk to
on.
you
It's
and
been a
also
really
dive
great
in a little
chat.
bit deeper into these 4 amazing works. And there you have it, the end of another episode of the Jo's Art History podcast. Thank you so much again to Bryony Large for coming on and discussing so brilliantly the ideal female form and the changing perception of the female form throughout art history. This was such an interesting discussion, and I particularly loved talking to her about Jenny Saville's work, Propped, and Marc Quinn's Alison Lapper sculpture, which is 2 works. If you do not know what these look like, please do go onto my Instagram and check my highlights reel under episode 28, where you will see the images that we've been discussing. They're very important works, and I would seriously encourage everybody who, if there's anything that we've discussed today that you don't know what it looks like visually, please do go and check out what it looks like and engage with these works. It's very important that you do. If you'd like to get in touch and discuss anything that you heard today in the episode, please feel free. You can email me, joesarthistory@gmail.com, or you can DM me via Instagram at joesarthistory. My DMs are always open, and hey, while you're on my Instagram, why not give me a wee follow? I don't just write about what I talk about on the podcast, I discuss lots of other art as well. While you were listening, if you thought of anybody that would benefit from listening to this episode themselves or that might find it of interest, please do feel free to pass on the episode to them. It would be brilliant to get more people interacting and listening to the podcast. That is always the plan after all. And if you can, it would mean a lot to me if you can like, rate and subscribe to the podcast, which means you will never miss another episode. And if you're able to as well, it would be absolutely brilliant if you could leave a review, as this also helps other people find the podcast. Finally, my name is Jo McLaughlin. I have been your host and your friendly art historian, and I look forward to welcoming you next time on the Jo's Art History podcast. Until then, keep learning, and remember, art is for all. Bye.